So if we start with the definition of natural selection is defined as, this is the theory that Darwin proposed, so he's most known for natural selection. It's when nature chooses or nature selects which organisms will survive. And so to be a little more specific, as the environment changes, whoever is able to quickly adapt to the environment are going to be the ones that get the resources who are actually going to be able to continue surviving. So natural selection is all about how quickly can you adapt to changes. The quicker you can adapt to changes, the more likely you're going to survive. The slower you adapt to changes, the more likely you're going to die out. So then that takes us into the conditions that have to exist in order for natural selection to take place. One of them is overpopulation. Now, the reason why this would be is if everyone had enough resources and there weren't too many people or organisms in a space, then nature really wouldn't have to choose who survives, because everyone should be able to survive equally. A second condition that has to be in place in order for natural selection to happen would be limited resources. So again, if there were enough resources for everyone, we wouldn't really need this whole idea of natural selection, the whole idea of some people can get and some people have to die. The third would be mutations. So mutations actually occur and they give rise to some organisms having different traits than others, and those different traits can then allow organisms to survive better. So having mutations actually would help you, or be something that would need to happen in order for natural selection to exist. And then the fourth would be struggle for existence. Struggle for existence can also be, we can use the word competition. And so the idea is, because there are not enough resources, things have to compete to get the resources they need. So those things that are able to compete the best are going to get the resources they need, and those would be the ones that are able to survive for longer periods of time. And so this was Charles Darwin's theory. So he is credited for the whole idea of natural selection. He's the father of evolution, is what we would call it. So if we go through some of the scientists that contributed to Darwin's work, these are going to be some important people to definitely know for the test. So let's erase this. The first one that we'll start with are the group of geologists. So the geologists, they studied rocks. And so the geologists that are going to be the most important for you to know would be Hutton and Lyell. So Hutton and Lyell, those are their last names. They studied rocks and how rocks changed over time, and they were the first to propose that Earth is millions of years old, not thousands. So up until this point, people believed, based off of biblical stories, that the Earth was only 1,000 years or a few thousand years old. But they were able, looking at the fossil record and looking at how mountains and different landforms formed, they were able to propose that Earth is actually millions of years old, and Earth gradually changes. So how this actually affects Darwin, or this contributes to Darwin's idea, is that if the Earth is old and things change slowly, then organisms must also change to be able to live on Earth. The next one that we'll talk about is Malthus, Thomas Malthus. He was an economist, so he studied kind of populations and different things. And he came up with the idea that populations grow exponentially, meaning they grow really, really quickly. So grow exponentially. So populations grow exponentially, but resources like space or air or water, resources grow linearly. So they grow a lot slower. So what this would mean if we were to plot this on a graph is population grows like this. Starts out low and then skyrockets really high. But resources like land and space and water grow kind of like this, like a straight line. Not as rapid. So what you notice is that eventually, like right here, it's going to get to a point where there's too many people for not enough resources. So what Malthus proposed is that something has to happen in order for the population to be decreased. What he proposed is that disease and famine and drought and things like that would lower the population, so that way there'd be enough resources for everyone. How this contributed to Darwin is Darwin said if there's limited resources and resources aren't growing fast enough, then something has to happen for some people to die out and some people to live. And so that really is important for his idea of natural selection. The next scientist that we'll talk about will be Lamarck. It's not directly on your study guide, but Lamarck is important because Lamarck was one of the first to propose kind of heredity. And the reason why this is important is he was the first to really propose that offspring inherit the traits of their parents. So if you have parents that have traits that will help you adapt better to the environment, then you will automatically get those traits, and then you should also be able to adapt to the environment. The evidence that he used for this was not correct, but the idea of how traits are passed on was actually correct, and that helped influence Darwin, because Darwin said, well, if nature is going to choose who survives, whoever survives will then be able to pass on those traits to their offspring so their offspring could also survive. Okay. So if we talk about the Galapagos Islands for a second, and this is referring to, I believe, question number 6 on the review. The Galapagos Islands are a unique collection of islands off of the coast of South America. So they're off of the western coast of South America. And the reason why they're a really good place to study evolution was that they actually, all of the islands have different climates. And that's actually something very unique. Most places you go to, you're not going to see a bunch of different climates kind of in the same little area. But that actually helped Darwin because not only did they have different climates, they had similar animals and plants. So he was able to kind of track how each of the animals and plants changed as he went from island to island. So he particularly studied the finches and the tortoises, and he saw that they were in all of the islands, but they look very different depending on what climate they were in. And the climate also dictates the vegetation, the types of fruits and plants that are in the area. So he was able to really study those species and see how they must have adapted or changed to better fit their climate or the area that they were in. So for fossils, fossils were important for Darwin because he was able to study fossils and see how organisms may have changed over time. One of the issues with the fossils that he studied and fossils in general is that not all organisms make fossils. So fossils are not a complete, they're not a complete snapshot of all organisms. So one of the things with fossils is only organisms that have bony or hard parts. So only organisms with bones or shells or something like that, they're only the ones that really be able to leave fossils behind. So if you think about all the different animals and organisms, not everything has bones and shells. So there are a lot of things that are missing from fossils, and we can't use fossils as a great way of proving evolution because we're missing a lot of gaps in time and a lot of organisms are not represented by fossils. So one thing we can say about fossils is that the fossil record, kind of all the different collections of fossils we have, is not complete. So there are a lot of plants and animals that would never be able to make fossils, like a jellyfish. So jellyfish obviously have lived millions of years, but they'll never be able to leave a fossil because they're soft. And in order to make a fossil, you need to have bones or something hard to kind of leave an imprint. One of the things Darwin also noticed with the fossils is that he was able to compare them to each other, but he didn't see very much of a change in the fossils. So it didn't really help prove his idea of natural selection. It just helped to prove that organisms have been around for a very long time. One thing to keep in mind too is that any type of way that an organism may have adapted, if it was something internal, like maybe their organs changed different sizes, that wouldn't be able to be seen in a fossil. So fossils really only are able to track like the big outside appearance. And if things aren't changing a lot on the outside, fossils aren't going to really be a good way to prove evolution. Okay. Darwin's book, in case they do ask, they like to ask kind of random questions about little facts about Darwin. So if we go over, so he went to the Galapagos Islands. A couple things about Darwin. He is English, so he is from England. These are just some little facts they like to throw in on tests. The name of his ship was the HMS Beagle. And he was a naturalist. If they asked like what was his job title, he was a naturalist, which just means they studied nature, studied animals. And the name of his book was On the Origin of Species. Right? And one little factoid to also keep in mind is that he sailed to the Galapagos Islands in like the 1830s. He stayed there for about 5 years. And when he came back in 1836, he actually did not rush to publish this book. He had it all written, but he didn't rush to publish it because he thought it wasn't going to be wildly accepted, because it went against the idea that God created everything, and it really would push forth the whole idea about science and evolution, which he was afraid was not going to be accepted at the time. So he actually didn't publish this book until almost 22 years after he went to the Galapagos Islands. So sometimes they like to ask, did he rush to publish his book? But no, he waited about 22, 23 years before he published his book. So then let me just pull up the next page of the review guide. All right. One of the questions that they may ask about too is, we know that Darwin did not rush to publish his work. And the reason why he actually, after 22 years, decided to publish it was because a guy named Alfred Wallace, he was also a naturalist. He actually started studying the same types of things that Darwin did, and he actually sent an essay to Darwin to kind of proofread. And Darwin actually saw that Wallace was getting close to discovering the whole idea of natural selection and evolution, so that actually motivated Darwin to kind of rush and publish his work. So sometimes they'll say that Darwin and Wallace worked together for the idea of natural selection. That's not really true. Darwin really discovered it first, he just never published it, and then Wallace came up with very similar ideas 22, 25 years later. So number 10, we've kind of talked about with Lamarck. One of the ideas with Lamarck and his law of acquired traits is that he would have said, like, for example, he would have said, let's say, and this is going to be a very rough sketch, so you have to use your imagination. So let's say this is you, and you decide to be a marathon runner. So you exercise a lot, you get your legs in great shape to be a marathon runner. So according to Lamarck, he would say that because you've worked so hard on your legs and your body and you're really fit and you're able to run a marathon, no problem, that when you have children, these are also going to be marathon runners. They're also going to be able to be very, very fit and be able to run and like running and doing all that type of stuff. So his idea with acquired traits is that an organism can change their appearance and change their DNA by certain behaviors. So if we exercise a lot, or if a giraffe stretches their neck really, really long, then that trait of stretching our neck really, really long will stay, and that will be able to be inherited to our offspring. And that's not true. I mean, you may have families where everyone likes to run, but just because a parent was a bodybuilder or a runner or has a lot of tattoos doesn't mean that automatically as soon as those kids are born, they're going to have those exact same traits. So his idea of how things were inherited was not correct. But the idea that things are inherited was something that was correct, that Mendel, which you guys learned about last unit, really studied a lot about. Lamarck also has this law of use and disuse. So that actually does kind of make sense. And the idea with this, so law of disuse and use, or use and disuse, is that if we use something, so the more you use a body part, and he was more so looking at body parts when he came up with this, the more you use a body part, the stronger it becomes. And that kind of makes sense. If we were to work out our legs, our legs would hopefully become stronger. Now, the reason why this would be important is the more an organism uses a certain body part, like a hand or a claw or a tail, the more likely that hand or claw or tail performs an important part in that organism's life. And more than likely, the more they use it, it's going to then get passed on to further generations. Where this is an important kind of idea is with vestigial organs. So vestigial organs are organs that are left over from previous generations that we don't really use anymore. So the example would be like our tailbone. The humans actually have a tailbone. We don't use it because obviously we don't have tails. So over millions of years, that tailbone has become less important. We haven't used it, so it's gotten smaller and smaller in each generation. So eventually, maybe in another 1,000 years, we won't even have a tailbone at all. You wouldn't even know. Another example would be our appendix. No one can really say why our appendix is important. We can actually get it removed and still be fine. But that's something that was left over from maybe way back when we actually needed the appendix. But because we don't use it, it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And now it's not even important at all. We can get it removed. So artificial selection is different than natural selection. Artificial selection would be when humans choose the traits that are desirable. So as an example, let's say we want to mix, a good example would be like horse breeding or dog breeding. We might take, let's say, a miniature poodle, and we might mate them with, let's say, a Doberman Pinscher. And then we can get a new dog species. So that's actually a lot of times what happens with a lot of these, they call them designer dogs. So they may mix different traits because they want the dog to be larger or faster or hypoallergenic. But artificial selection is where humans choose which traits they want. They choose which traits are desirable. So whatever traits are desirable, they make sure those are the ones that get passed on. Whereas with natural selection, nature is choosing kind of who survives based off of who can adapt the quickest. So one of the things to keep in mind, the difference between a variation and an adaptation is that a variation is just a difference. Doesn't mean it's a good difference, doesn't mean it's a bad difference. So blue eyes versus green eyes versus brown eyes, those are just differences. But a variation can become an adaptation if your eye color somehow benefits you or helps you to survive. So let's say, as an example, height. Height is just a variation. Everyone has different size heights. Not everyone is the same height. But height can become an adaptation if it is a difference that benefits you. So if it's a difference that does not benefit you, we just say it's a variation, makes you different. But let's say for some reason, now being tall helps, I don't know, get plants. Maybe you can reach up higher and get plants that the shorter organisms couldn't get. Now your height, which is a difference, has actually become an adaptation. It allows you to actually survive better than others. Okay. A lot of times our variations or our differences come based off of what we say allele frequencies, or how frequently different traits get passed on. We can also use the words gene pool here. A gene pool is just a collection. This is just a collection of traits. So if we were to look at all the different traits for or possibilities for eye color, so green, blue, black, brown eyes, that's just what makes up the gene pool. The allele frequency is how those letters are inherited. So big B, or big B, or little b. How often each of these happens is what we call the allele frequency. But those just help to give rise to different variety. Okay. One of the things that Darwin noticed with the finches is that they had different sized beaks. And the different sized beaks were based off of the types of foods that they needed to eat. So if they had to eat hard shells, they usually had very thick beaks to break through the shells. If they had to eat like fruit or nectar, they had very long, thin beaks so that they could reach inside of plants to get that nectar and fruit. Okay? So if we go over some of the evidences that Darwin used for evolution, the big five would be, he did look at fossils. He studied embryology, so he looked at how things develop over time. He also looked at homologous structures. So homologous structures are structures that are the same bone structure but different function. So I'll say same parts but different use. So an example would be the human arm and the dolphin fin. We both come from the mammal ancestor, same parts, but we use them for different purposes. Obviously, the dolphin uses it to swim, and we use our arms to grab, lift, pull, things like that. He also looked at vestigial organs. So he looked at, are there body parts that organisms have in common that they have over time stopped using? And then the last thing that he looked at is geographical distribution. Basically, Are there clusters of where certain organisms live? If so, they probably evolved from that particular area. So those would be the 5: fossils, embryology, homologous structures, vestigial organs, and geographic distribution. Okay. One of the things to note for fossils is fossils usually form in something called sedimentary rock. And that's just rock that is made in layers. So if you imagine laying down a piece of carpet on the floor. So let's say we lay down a piece of carpet. And then on the carpet, we lay down another rug on top of it. And then on top of that rug, we lay down, let's say, a mat here. And then on top of that mat, let's say we lay down another rug. And if we push all these layers together really, really tightly, that would be an example of sedimentary rock. We're just putting layers on top of layers. It's a really great way to make fossils because if a fossil, let's say something were to fall and die right here, all those other layers kind of compress it and push it down and preserve it in place. So sedimentary rock is where we find fossils. Okay. One of the things to keep in mind with evolution is that we have a few different types of how things evolve. We have convergent evolution, which is the same as convergent evolution versus divergent evolution. Okay. One of the big differences, con means coming together. So these are things that have different ancestors, but they look alike. But over time, they've grown to look alike. So an example would be the dolphin and the shark. So the dolphin comes from the mammal ancestor, the shark comes from the fish. So they're coming from different ancestors, but obviously the dolphin and the shark look a lot alike because they live in the same environment, so they've grown to look very similar. Divergent, if you think of di meaning different, these guys come from the same ancestor, but they look different. So an example would be the bat and the human. Bats and humans are both mammals, but bats fly, humans don't. Bats live in different areas that humans don't live in. So we've grown to look very different based off of our environments. Okay. The last thing we'll talk about in this video is going to be the types of selection. So there's a few different types of selection that will happen. We said natural selection in general, nature chooses who survives. So based off of how nature chooses, there's a couple different graphs that are important to know for selection. We have disruptive selection. So that what happens in disruptive selection is that over time, let's say we start with a population that's kind of like this. Let's say we're tracking weight or something, and everyone's kind of right here in the middle, like this bell curve. The average is right about here. What happens with disruptive selection is over time, based off of how nature changes, you end up with this. So nature starts to favor those things on the extreme. So maybe get everyone that's like average height somehow has a disadvantage, and now nature is choosing things that are lower weight versus things that are higher weights. So this would be disruptive selection, where over time nature is choosing the things on the two extremes. Okay. Another example of what can happen because of natural selection is stabilizing selection. Okay. So if we have our graph, let's say what happens with stabilizing selection, let's say the population used to look like this, so everything's kind of an average in the middle. What happens with stabilizing is over time, based off of natural selection, we get this type of thing. Like this big steep curve where we're favoring only the things in the middle, where everything kind of starts to be like this middle guy here. An example for that would be birth weight. Babies that are born too small usually have problems. They may die. Babies that are born too big also have problems too. So birth weight we have this nice little ideal range of what we want our babies to be born in. About 7 to 9 pounds is kind of the average range. So over time we start to favor things right in the middle. Let's see. And let me just find the last type of selection that's important to know is directional selection. And so I'll do that over here. And directional selection, just kind of from its name, you start to move in one direction. So directional selection. So that would be if the graph starts to be, let's say, is like this. It starts out like this, like what we expect. Over time, based off of natural selection, this whole graph may shift over and start to be like this. So everything starts to shift to a higher extreme. An example of this would be height. If we were to track our height, our average height, or even our longevity, how long we live, let's say in like 1830s, someone might have only been 5 foot. That might be considered tall. But over time, as we've gotten better health care, our height has shifted to now the average height might be now 5'7" or 5'8". Same thing is true if we're looking at the average adult weight. So the average adult weight, let's say 50 years ago, might have been around here. But over time, that average adult weight is going higher. We're going towards the higher end. So directional selection, you're being pushed in one direction. Now you could be being pushed this way, or you could be being pushed backwards this way, but your population, if we were to trace it, is being pushed towards one end. So just a quick review. Disruptive would be where you start in the middle, and over time, your population starts to favor the extremes. Stabilizing would be where over time, you start to favor just the guys in the middle. And then directional would be over time where you actually start to see all of the traits getting shifted towards one end.